The steamboat Belle Marie carried 43 souls into the Louisiana Bayou on October 15, 1892. Only the vessel returned. This isn't just another missing persons case. It's the story of how an entire family turned the remote waterways of southern Louisiana into their personal hunting ground, and how the swamp itself became complicit in hiding their crimes. The autumn mist hung thick over Bayou La Fourche that morning, carrying the scent of decay and Spanish moss, while the water lapped against cypress knees with an almost musical rhythm. Captain Henri Boudreaux had navigated these waters for 27 years, ferrying passengers between New Orleans and the scattered settlements deeper in the wetlands. The Belle Marie was his pride, a modest paddle wheeler that could navigate the narrower channels where larger vessels feared to venture. The passenger manifest that October day read like a cross-section of Louisiana society. Wealthy merchants seeking timber rights, Creole families visiting relatives in remote settlements, a Methodist minister carrying Bibles to isolated communities, even a photographer from Harper's Weekly, documenting life in America's forgotten corners. Before we dive deeper into this nightmare, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is in your world right now. And if this story grabs you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we're about to uncover gets much darker. The Belle Marie departed New Orleans at dawn, her paddle wheel churning the brown water as she wound deeper into the maze of waterways. Passengers gathered on deck despite the humid air, marveling at the alien landscape of the bayou. Ancient cypress trees draped in moss created a canopy so thick that daylight barely penetrated to the water's surface. Alligators sunned themselves on fallen logs. Great blue herons stood motionless as statues. By noon, the steamboat had passed the last major settlement at Boudreaux and entered the truly wild sections of the bayou. Here, the channels branched like arteries, some leading to hidden communities that appeared on no official maps. Captain Boudreaux knew them all, or thought he did. The first sign of trouble came at 2:30 that afternoon. The Belle Marie's engine began to sputter and smoke. Captain Boudreaux ordered the vessel anchored near a small island, while his engineer, a gruff Irishman named Patrick Murphy, investigated the problem. A broken drive belt, Murphy reported. Easily fixed, but they'd need to wait for the engine to cool. File note: October 15, 1892, Captain's Log, Steamboat Belle Marie, engine failure at mile marker 47, passengers growing restless, strange smell in the air, like meat left too long in the sun. While the crew worked, several passengers noticed smoke rising from deeper in the swamp. Not the gray smoke of a chimney, but thick black columns that suggested something large burning. The photographer, a man named James Whitmore, set up his camera to capture what he assumed was a controlled burn. Plantation owners clearing land for next season's crops. The swamp watched them with hungry eyes. As afternoon stretched toward evening, a flatboat emerged from the tree line. 3 men poled it toward the Belle Marie, calling out in the thick Cajun dialect common to the region. They offered to help with repairs, to guide the steamboat to a safe harbor for the night. Their leader, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and eyes like chips of flint, introduced himself as Anatole Boudreaux, claiming distant kinship with the captain. Captain Henri studied the approaching men with growing unease. Something in their manner set his teeth on edge, though he couldn't articulate what. The way they moved with predatory grace. The 2 bright smiles that never reached their eyes. The fact that their flatboat rode strangely low in the water, as if carrying a heavy, hidden cargo. But darkness was falling, and the bayou at night was no place for a steamboat full of civilians. Against his better judgment, Captain Henri accepted their offer of escort to what they called a safe mooring. The flatboat led them down a channel so narrow that cypress branches scraped the Belle Marie's sides with sounds like fingernails on coffin wood. Spanish moss draped across the deck like funeral shrouds. Passengers retreated to the salon, unnerved by the oppressive atmosphere of this deeper swamp. Passenger letter fragment found later. The trees seem to lean in toward us, as if they're hungry. Mary says I'm being foolish, but I swear I can hear voices in the wind, and they're not speaking English. At 8:15 that evening, the Belle Marie reached what appeared to be a natural harbor formed by a bend in the bayou. The guides assured Captain Henri this was the safest place to anchor for the night. They even offered to post guards around the vessel, claiming that pirates still operated in these remote waters. The captain's instincts screamed warnings, but what choice did he have? His passengers included women and children. The alternative was navigating treacherous waters in total darkness. As the steamboat's lights dimmed and her passengers settled in for an uneasy night, Anatole Boudreaux and his men began their work. They had been hunting these waters for 7 years, perfecting their methods with each group of victims. They knew exactly how to make a boat full of people disappear without a trace. The screaming started at midnight. What happened aboard the Belle Marie during those dark hours would remain hidden for weeks, concealed in the twisted maze of the Louisiana Bayou. But when searchers finally began to piece together the truth, they would uncover evidence of crimes so systematic and brutal that the very swamp seemed to recoil from the memory. How do 43 people vanish from a steamboat without disturbing the vessel itself? And what kind of monsters could orchestrate such a perfect disappearance? The Belle Marie drifted empty through morning mist, her paddle wheel still and silent as a tomb. Not a soul remained aboard. This discovery would launch the largest manhunt in Louisiana history, but the searchers had no idea they were tracking a family that had turned murder into an art form. The alarm bell at the Boudreaux telegraph office clanged incessantly at 7:45 a.m. on October 16th, its brass voice cutting through the humid air that smelled of coffee and fresh-baked bread from the nearby bakery. The rough wooden floor vibrated under the boots of Sheriff Auguste Melançon as he burst through the door, still buttoning his vest after the frantic summons. The message had come from a timber crew working the upper reaches of Bayou Lafourche. Their foreman, a methodical German immigrant named Klaus Richter, had spotted the Belle Marie adrift in a side channel, her engines cold and her decks deserted. The steamboat showed no signs of damage. No bullet holes, no fire damage, no indication of mechanical failure. She simply floated like a ghost ship, abandoned by her human cargo. Sheriff Melançon assembled a search party within the hour. 12 men, including 2 Cajun guides, who knew the bayou's labyrinthine waterways better than their own backyards. They loaded supplies into 3 pirogues, the narrow canoes that could navigate the shallowest channels, and set out following the timber crew's directions. The sound of their paddles dipping into brackish water created an almost hypnotic rhythm as they wound deeper into the swamp. Ancient cypress trees rose like cathedral pillars around them, their roots forming buttresses that had stood since before the first European ever glimpsed these waters. The air grew thick with the smell of decomposition, not the clean decay of autumn leaves, but something more organic, more disturbing. Telegraph message. October 16th, 1892, Boudreaux Station to New Orleans. Belle Marie found abandoned. No passengers, no crew, no blood. Send help immediately. They found the steamboat exactly as Richter had described, drifting in a natural eddy formed by fallen trees, her hull scraping gently against cypress knees with each small wave. Sheriff Melançon was first aboard, his boots echoing hollowly on the empty deck. The vessel was pristine. Passenger luggage remained neatly stowed in cabins. A half-finished game of checkers sat on a table in the salon, red and black pieces waiting for players who would never return. In the galley, breakfast preparations had been abandoned mid-task. Eggs congealed in a skillet. Coffee grew cold in tin cups. A loaf of bread sat half-sliced on the cutting board, the knife beside it clean and sharp. Whatever had happened to the 43 souls aboard, it had occurred with such precision that normal life simply stopped. The search party spent 3 hours examining every inch of the Belle Marie. They found Captain Boudreaux's logbook, the final entry, dated October 15th at 8:15 p.m. Anchored at safe harbor, guides posted, all passengers secure. After that, nothing but blank pages. Deputy Marcel Thibodeau, a young Creole with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, noticed something the others had missed. "Sheriff," he called from the stern, "look at this." The steamboat's anchor chain hung slack in the water, but the anchor itself was missing. More telling still, the chain had been cut, not by accident or corrosion, but by deliberate blade work. Someone had wanted the Belle Marie to drift. Something moved in the deeper shadows. As afternoon heat began to build, Sheriff Melançon made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of returning to Thibodeau for reinforcements, he ordered the search party to explore the immediate area. 43 people couldn't simply vanish into thin air. There had to be evidence, survivors, some trace of what had befallen them. The bayou surrendered its secrets reluctantly. The search teams split up, each taking a different channel radiating out from where they'd found the Belle Marie. Deputy Thibodeau's group followed a narrow waterway that wound deeper into the swamp, past islands thick with palmetto and wild cane. The water here ran dark as coffee, stained by tannins from countless fallen leaves. At 4:20 that afternoon, they found the first raft. It was a crude thing, lashed together from cypress logs and held afloat by empty barrels. But what made Deputy Thibodeau's blood run cold wasn't the raft itself. It was what covered its surface. Dark stains that could only be blood had soaked deep into the wood, creating patterns that suggested something large had been butchered there. Flies swarmed over the dried residue, their buzzing the only sound in the oppressive silence. More rafts emerged from the mist as they continued their search. 5 in total, each bearing the same grisly evidence, each large enough to hold 8 or 9 people, each stained with enough blood to suggest that whatever had happened aboard them had been systematic, thorough, and utterly without mercy. Deputies report, October 16, 1892, found makeshift slaughter platforms. Blood patterns suggest victims were processed like livestock. God help us all. As evening approached, the search teams regrouped at a small island that seemed to serve as a natural landmark. Sheriff Melançon studied the maps his Cajun guides had sketched, trying to make sense of the evidence. The blood-soaked rafts suggested that the passengers had been taken alive from the Belle Marie, transported to these makeshift killing floors, and then processed. But processed for what purpose? And by whom? The answer lay deeper in the swamp, hidden in a network of channels that appeared on no official charts. As darkness began to fall and strange sounds echoed through the Spanish moss, Sheriff Melançon faced a terrible choice: retreat to safety and risk losing the trail, or venture deeper into waters where something unspeakable waited in the shadows. What they would discover in those hidden channels would reveal that the Belle Marie massacre was not an isolated incident, but merely the latest harvest in a reign of terror that had claimed hundreds of victims over the course of 7 blood-soaked years. Steam rose from cooking pots filled with human remains. The smell of rendered flesh hung thick in the evening air. This wasn't random violence. It was an industrial operation that had been perfecting its methods for nearly a decade, hidden in the heart of America's most impenetrable wilderness. The deeper channels reeked of sulfur and rotting vegetation, their surfaces broken by the occasional splash of something large moving beneath the dark water. Sheriff Melançon's search party pressed forward as twilight painted the cypress canopy in shades of blood and shadow. The wooden hull of Deputy Thibodeau's pirogue scraped against submerged logs with each stroke of his paddle, creating sounds like bones grinding together. 3 miles from where they'd discovered the blood-soaked rafts, the searchers encountered their first sign of permanent habitation. A crude dock built from salvaged lumber and cypress poles. Fresh rope marks on the pilings suggested recent use. More disturbing still, human hair clung to the rough wood, as if people had been dragged across its surface. Beyond the dock, a narrow path wound through towering canebrakes toward what appeared to be a cluster of structures hidden in a grove of ancient live oaks. The Cajun guide, a weathered man named Boudreaux, no relation to the missing captain, crossed himself and whispered in French. When pressed to translate, he would only say that his grandmother had warned him about this place, though she'd never explained why. The settlement consisted of 4 ramshackle cabins arranged around a central clearing. Smoke drifted from stone chimneys, suggesting the inhabitants had fled recently, perhaps warned by lookouts posted along the bayou channels. But what the searchers found inside those cabins would haunt them until their dying days. Sheriff's Report Fragment. October 16, 1892. Entered first structure at dusk. Found evidence of systematic butchery. No longer hunting missing passengers, now hunting monsters. The largest cabin served as what could only be described as a processing facility. Long wooden tables bore axe marks and stains that told their own grisly story. Meat hooks hung from the rafters, some still bearing scraps of clothing that had been torn away from victims. Barrels lined the walls, filled with a brine solution that preserved what Deputy Thibodeau initially mistook for salt pork, until he recognized the distinctive shape of human fingers floating in the murky liquid. But it was the second cabin that revealed the true scope of the horror. Floor to ceiling, the walls were lined with human skulls, hundreds of them, arranged with obsessive care, according to size and condition. Some bore the smooth dome of adult craniums. Others, heartbreakingly small, belonged to children. Each had been cleaned and polished until the bone gleamed white as porcelain. A ledger book sat open on a rough-hewn table in the center of the skull room. The handwriting was precise, almost scholarly, recording dates and numbers with the detached efficiency of a business transaction. October 12th, 7 adults, 2 children. October 8th, flatboat family, 5 total. September 30th, timber crew, 8 men. The entries stretched back 7 years. Hell had made its home in Louisiana. The third cabin contained living quarters, beds, personal belongings, evidence that a family had made this nightmare their home. Photographs on a mantel showed 3 generations of the same bloodline, grandfather, father, and sons, all sharing the same predatory eyes that had stared out from the faces of the men who'd guided the Belle Marie to its doom. The family name, inscribed on a Bible whose pages had been stained with substances better left unidentified, was Boudreaux. Distant cousins of the missing captain, as they'd claimed. Deputy Thibodeau found children's toys scattered around one corner of the room. wooden dolls, a miniature rocking horse, evidence that innocence had once existed here before being twisted into something monstrous. How do you raise children in a place where murder is the family business? How do you explain to a 6-year-old why screams echo through the night? The fourth cabin held the answers to questions no sane person should ask. This was where the Boudreaux clan prepared their victims for what came next. Shackles bolted to the walls, tables equipped with restraints, tools arranged with surgical precision, knives, saws, hooks, devices whose purpose could only be guessed at through the stains they bore. Inventory list, found in fourth cabin, 12 bone saws, various sizes, 37 skinning knives, 1 guillotine, homemade, assorted restraining devices. But the most disturbing discovery waited outside, behind the cabins where the forest grew thick and dark. Here, the Boudreaux family had established what could only be called their boneyard, acre upon acre of human remains buried in shallow graves. Some graves were marked with crude wooden crosses bearing dates and numbers. Others lay unmarked, anonymous victims whose stories would never be told. Sheriff Melançon stood among the graves as full darkness fell, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. This wasn't the work of a few months or even a year. The Boudreaux clan had been hunting the bayou for the better part of a decade, perfecting their methods with each group of victims. They'd turned the remote waterways into their personal killing ground, using the swamp itself as both camouflage and accomplice. The timber crews that worked these waters, the families seeking new lives in remote settlements, the merchants and missionaries who'd trusted local guides to see them safely through the maze of channels. All had fallen prey to a family that had abandoned every trace of humanity in favor of something far more primitive and infinitely more dangerous. As the search party prepared makeshift torches to light their way back to civilization, a new sound echoed through the darkness, the distant splash of paddles moving through water. Someone was approaching through the network of channels, moving with the confidence of those who knew these waters intimately. The Boudreaux clan was coming home, and they would not be pleased to find uninvited guests examining their life's work. The splash of approaching paddles cut through night silence like a death knell. Sheriff Melançon's search party found themselves trapped in the killer's own lair. What happened next would prove that some families passed down more than just recipes and family names. They passed down an appetite for human flesh that spans generations. The torches flickered like dying stars against the oppressive darkness as Sheriff Melançon's men crouched among the boneyard graves, their breathing shallow and controlled. The sound of multiple pirogues grew closer, accompanied by voices speaking in rapid Cajun French. Deputy Thibodeau, who'd grown up hearing the dialect, translated in urgent whispers. They were discussing the harvest from the steamboat and debating whether to return to their hideout or seek new hunting grounds. The searchers had stumbled into something far more organized than a simple family of killers. As the voices grew clearer, it became apparent that the Boudreaux clan operated with military precision. Scouts reported on potential targets. Lookouts monitored the main channels for law enforcement. Even the youngest members had specific roles in what amounted to a generational enterprise built on systematic murder. From their hiding spot behind a massive live oak, Sheriff Melançon counted at least 6 distinct voices. Men, women, and what sounded like adolescents, an entire family structure devoted to predation. The casual tone of their conversation chilled him more than any screaming could have. They discussed their victims with the same detachment a farmer might use to talk about livestock, referring to the fat merchant from New Orleans and those tender children from the minister's family. The first pirogue slid into view at 9:43 p.m., its occupants clearly visible in the moonlight filtering through the Spanish moss. Anatole Boudreaux sat in the stern, his weathered face split by a satisfied grin as he directed two younger men, his sons, based on their shared features, toward the dock. The boat rode low in the water, weighed down by bulky sacks that moved with a disturbingly organic rhythm. Overheard conversation, October 16, 1892. Papa, the little ones fought harder than expected. Made quite a mess of the processing raft. No matter, boy. Fresh meat always struggles. Gives it flavor. The second pirogue carried an elderly woman whose silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and a girl who couldn't have been more than 16. Grandmother and granddaughter continuing the family tradition. The old woman supervised as the girl helped unload their grisly cargo, offering praise when the teenager handled a particularly heavy sack with practiced efficiency. 3 generations of butchers, working together like any normal family business. The third boat held the most disturbing sight yet. Children, probably between 10 and 14 years old, handling human remains with the same casual familiarity other kids might show toward fishing gear. They'd been raised in this nightmare, taught from infancy that other humans were nothing more than prey animals. The innocence that should have protected them had been methodically corrupted, replaced with something that could look upon dismembered corpses and see only the next meal. The family worked with frightening efficiency. As the Boudreaux clan began unloading their boats, Sheriff Melançon faced an impossible choice. His 12-man search party was outnumbered and outgunned by killers who knew every inch of this terrain. A direct confrontation would likely result in their own deaths, adding to the already staggering body count. But allowing these monsters to continue their work was equally unthinkable. The decision was made for him when Deputy Thibodeau's foot slipped on the muddy bank, sending a cascade of small stones into the water below. The sound wasn't loud, but in the cathedral silence of the swamp, it might as well have been a gunshot. Anatole Boudreaux's head snapped up immediately, his predator's instincts honed by years of hunting. His hand moved to the long knife at his belt as he scanned the darkness beyond the torchlight. "Someone's watching," he said in English, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Spread out. Find them." The family moved with practiced coordination, fanning out to surround the area where the search party lay hidden. These weren't desperate criminals acting on impulse. They were apex predators who'd learned to hunt humans the same way wolves hunt deer. They understood how their prey thought, how they moved, where they'd try to hide. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse through the darkened swamp. The Boudreaux family used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to herd the searchers deeper into the maze of channels and islands, cutting off escape routes with the patience of experienced hunters. They moved almost silently through water and undergrowth, communicating through hand signals and bird calls that sounded natural to untrained ears. Sheriff Melançon's men found themselves fighting for their lives against an enemy that had turned murder into an art form. The killers used the swamp itself as a weapon, leading pursuers into quicksand, forcing them toward alligator nests, using the twisted geography to separate and isolate their targets. Deputy's final report fragment. "They hunt us like animals, children with knives, grandmother with rope. This is not random violence, it's evolution gone wrong." By midnight, the search party had been reduced to 7 men, scattered across multiple islands with no hope of regrouping before dawn. The Boudreaux clan had claimed 5 victims using methods that left no gunshots to alert distant settlements. just the quiet efficiency of knives in the dark and bodies that would never be found in the endless expanse of the Louisiana Bayou. As Sheriff Melançon crouched in a stand of palmetto, listening to the hunters closing in around him, he realized that his mission had fundamentally changed. He was no longer seeking justice for the passengers of the Belle Marie. He was fighting for his own survival against a family that had spent 7 years perfecting the art of making people disappear. But what the remaining searchers would discover in the hours before dawn would reveal that the Boudreaux clan's appetite for human flesh was more than just criminal insanity. It was a hunger that had been carefully cultivated and passed down through generations, creating something that was no longer entirely human. A child's diary revealed the horrifying truth. The Boudreaux family hadn't always been killers. Something had changed them, generation by generation, into the nightmare they'd become. This transformation from ordinary settlers into systematic predators would explain how an entire bloodline could abandon humanity itself, and why the swamp had become their willing accomplice. The acrid smell of burning wood mingled with fog that rose from the warming earth as dawn broke over the killing grounds on October 17th. Sheriff Melançon and his 3 surviving deputies had spent the night moving through waist-deep water, using submerged cypress roots for cover, while the Boudreaux clan systematically hunted them. The texture of mud and rotting vegetation clung to their clothes like a second skin, marking them as intruders in this predatory family's domain. In the gray light of morning, Deputy Thibodeau discovered something that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about their pursuers. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the main cabin, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the humidity, lay a collection of documents that told the true story of how monsters are made. The earliest record was a land grant dated 1857, awarding Émile Boudreaux and his family 2,000 acres of unsurveyable wetlands in exchange for their service as guides for government survey expeditions. The original Émile appeared to have been a legitimate businessman, a Cajun patriarch who'd built a modest fortune helping newcomers navigate the treacherous bayou channels. But tragedy had a way of twisting good intentions into something unrecognizable. Personal letter. Found in collection, June 3rd, 1864. The war has taken everything. Union soldiers burned our crops, killed our livestock. The children cry from hunger. Émile grows desperate. The Civil War had devastated the family's legitimate enterprises. Federal troops, viewing all Cajuns as potential Confederate sympathizers, had systematically destroyed their property and driven away their customers. With no legal means of supporting his extended family, Émile Boudreaux had made a choice that would doom his descendants for generations. The first disappeared travelers had probably been genuine accidents, desperate people taking what they needed to survive, then discovering that the remote bayou was the perfect place to hide evidence. But as Sheriff Melançon read through the progressively disturbing documents, he could trace the exact moment when necessity transformed into appetite. A journal entry from Émile's son, Auguste, dated 1869, described the family's first deliberate murder with clinical detachment. Father says we must think of them as livestock, no different than butchering a pig. The meat tastes no different, and God has clearly provided them for our use, or he would not have led them to our waters. The rationalization was complete. Each generation had refined the family's methods, passing down not just techniques, but philosophy. Children born into this environment learned to see other humans as prey before they learned to read. The family had created its own twisted theology, viewing their isolation in the swamp as divine providence. God had placed them here to cull the weak and foolish who ventured into their domain. A child's diary, written in careful script by someone who couldn't have been more than 12 years old, provided the most chilling insight into how this corruption was transmitted. Grand-mère says the outside people are not like us. They are soft and weak because they have forgotten how to truly live. When I am older, Papa will teach me the family business, and I will help feed our bloodline as my brothers do. Medical journal entry found among papers Dr. François Boudreaux, 1883, have documented physical changes in family members over successive generations. Prolonged consumption of human flesh appears to trigger evolutionary adaptations. The most disturbing discovery was a series of medical observations recorded by François Boudreaux, Auguste's eldest son, who'd received formal training as a physician before returning to the family business. His notes described physiological changes he'd observed in relatives who'd been consuming human flesh for extended periods: enhanced night vision, increased bone density, modifications to digestive processes that allowed them to extract maximum nutrition from their victims. Whether these observations represented genuine biological adaptation or the delusions of a man trying to justify unspeakable acts, they revealed a family that had convinced itself it was evolving into something superior to ordinary humanity. They weren't simply killers. They were predators who viewed their crimes as natural selection in action. The family had become apex hunters. As Sheriff Melançon studied these documents in the growing daylight, he began to understand the systematic nature of the Boudreaux clan's operations. They didn't simply kill for food or profit. They hunted to maintain what they saw as their rightful position atop the food chain. Every victim strengthened their conviction that they were nature's chosen instruments, pruning weakness from the human species. The sound of approaching boats interrupted his research. The family was returning from their night hunt, and based on the satisfied voices carrying across the water, they'd been successful. Sheriff Melançon and his remaining men faced a terrible reality. They were trapped in a killing ground designed by 7 generations of human predators, with no hope of escape before the hunters returned to claim their lair. But hidden among the family's documents was information that might level the playing field. Detailed maps of the bayou's hidden channels, including escape routes the Boudreaux clan used when larger forces threatened their territory. Could 3 desperate lawmen use the killer's own knowledge against them? Or would they become the latest entries in a blood-soaked family ledger that stretched back nearly 4 decades? The escape route led straight through the heart of the Boudreaux hunting grounds. Sheriff Melançon faced an impossible choice: certain death by staying, or probable death by running. This moment would determine whether justice could survive in a place where human law meant nothing, and the only currency was blood. The hand-drawn map crackled like old parchment as Deputy Thibodeau spread it across the cabin floor, his fingers tracing the intricate network of channels that François Boudreaux had spent decades perfecting. The smell of kerosene from their makeshift lamp mixed with the lingering odor of death that permeated every surface, while the rough wooden planks beneath them bore stains that told stories no man should know. According to the family's own records, a hidden channel ran north from the main settlement, winding through a section of swamp so treacherous that even experienced guides avoided it. The Boudreaux clan called it Devil's Thread, a passage barely wide enough for a single pirogue, flanked by quicksand bogs and infested with the largest alligators in the bayou. But it was also their primary escape route when larger forces threatened their territory. Sheriff Melançon studied the approaching sounds of the returning hunters. 3 boats, moving with the confidence of predators who owned these waters. In 15 minutes, maybe 20, the family would reach their dock and discover that their sanctuary had been violated. The time for gathering evidence had passed. Now survival was the only priority. "We take the devil's thread," Hiwo whispered to his remaining men. "Better to die fighting the swamp than become dinner for those monsters." Map notation. François Boudreaux. Channel navigable only at high tide. Beware the matriarch, 12-foot female who has learned to hunt in darkness. The three survivors slipped from the cabin as quietly as shadows, moving toward the hidden channel that François had marked with cryptic symbols. Their stolen pirogue sat low in the water, weighted down with evidence that would shock civilized Louisiana if they lived long enough to present it. The family's ledgers, photographs, and medical journals represented proof of crimes spanning nearly 4 decades. But the Boudreaux clan had spent generations learning to read sign in the bayou, and Sheriff Melançon's men had left traces that glowed like beacons to experienced hunters. Disturbed mud, bent grass, the lingering scent of fear sweat that predators could detect from remarkable distances. Within minutes of reaching their boats, the family would know exactly which direction their prey had fled. The devil's thread lived up to its reputation from the first stroke of their paddles. The channel was so narrow that Spanish moss brushed their faces like grasping fingers, and the water ran black as coffee with tannins that had been steeping for centuries. Ancient cypress trees leaned inward from both banks, their root systems creating a maze of underwater obstacles that could trap or overturn an unwary vessel. The matriarch struck without warning. A 12-foot alligator erupted from the dark water beside their pirogue, jaws agape and eyes reflecting their lamplight like chips of yellow fire. Deputy Thibodeau drove his paddle deep into the creature's throat, feeling teeth scrape against wood as the beast twisted away in surprise rather than pain. The attack had been territorial rather than predatory, but it served as a reminder that they were intruders in a realm governed by appetites older than human civilization. Death stalks these waters. Behind them, voices echoed through the swamp as the Boudreaux family discovered their violated sanctuary. The hunters' initial confusion quickly transformed into rage, then into the methodical anger of predators whose territory had been marked by inferior creatures. They would follow the devil's thread, but they would follow it with patience, knowing that the treacherous channel would do much of their work for them. As Sheriff Melançon's group navigated deeper into the Nightmare Passage, they encountered evidence of previous escapes, or attempted escapes. Wrecked pirogues hung from submerged branches like crucifixes, their occupants long since claimed by the swamp or the family's appetites. Some bore bullet holes, others showed the distinctive marks of axes and machetes. The Boudreaux clan had been hunting this channel for decades, perfecting ambush points and learning to use the terrain itself as a weapon. The pursuit began in earnest at 3:15 a.m., announced by the distant sound of multiple boats entering the Devil's Thread. The family moved with supernatural confidence through waters that challenged experienced swampmen, their intimate knowledge of every obstacle and current allowing them to close the gap with terrifying efficiency. But Sheriff Melançon had advantages the family hadn't counted on. François Boudreaux's maps revealed not just the main channel, but secondary passages that could be used for ambush or evasion. Hidden islands where a careful man could wait in darkness. Underwater hazards that could disable pursuing vessels if approached from the correct angle. The final confrontation came as dawn broke over a stretch of open water that François had marked as the killing pool. Here, the channel widened into a natural arena surrounded by impenetrable walls of vegetation. Multiple passages led away from the pool, but only one led to safety, and the Boudreaux family knew which one. As the hunters emerged from the tree line with weapons drawn and murder in their eyes, Sheriff Melançon made a discovery that would change everything about what they thought they knew about the Louisiana Bayou. What he found floating in the center of the killing pool would prove that the Belle Marie massacre was not an ending, but a beginning, and that some hungers can never be satisfied. Bodies floated in the killing pool like a grotesque constellation, their pale forms arranged in patterns that suggested ritual rather than random murder. Sheriff Melançon realized the Belle Marie massacre had been a ceremony. This discovery would reveal that the Boudreaux family wasn't just harvesting victims. They were feeding something far older and hungrier than themselves. The morning mist clung to the water's surface like funeral shrouds as Sheriff Melançon counted 43 corpses floating in the natural amphitheater of cypress and Spanish moss. The smell of decomposition mixed with something else. Incense, candle wax, the lingering residue of substances burned in quantities that suggested religious observance. The rough bark of ancient trees bore carved symbols that predated any European presence in Louisiana, spiraling patterns that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. Each body had been positioned with obsessive care. The passengers from the Belle Marie floated in a perfect circle around a central platform built from cypress logs and human bones. Captain Henri Boudreaux lay at the hub, his uniform stripped away and his flesh bearing marks that spoke of prolonged torture rather than simple execution. This hadn't been murder for profit or even sustenance. It had been sacrifice. The Boudreaux clan emerged from the surrounding channels like manifestations of the swamp itself, their pirogues sliding through the dark water with predatory grace. Anatole stood in the bow of the lead vessel, no longer bothering to maintain his facade of civilized humanity. His weathered face had transformed into something that belonged more to beast than man, eyes reflecting morning light with an inhuman gleam. "You shouldn't have come here, Sheriff," he called across the water, his voice carrying the authority of something that had long ago abandoned human law. "This place is sacred, older than your churches, older than your laws. The water here has been drinking blood since before your kind learned to walk upright." Deputy Thibodeau raised his rifle, but Sheriff Melançon stayed his hand. They were outnumbered 3-1 by killers who knew every inch of this terrain. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that they'd stumbled into something far more complex than a family of cannibals. Ancient symbol translation, found later. Choctaw origin. Where the hungry water lives age. Pre-Columbian. The platform at the center of the killing pool wasn't recent construction. Weathered wood and bleached bones suggested it had been rebuilt and maintained for generations, possibly centuries. The symbols carved into the support posts matched descriptions from the earliest French colonial records, warnings about places where the indigenous people refused to hunt or fish, waters they considered cursed by entities that demanded regular appeasement. The Boudreaux family hadn't created this nightmare. They'd inherited it. As the hunters closed their circle around the trapped lawmen, Anatole began to speak in a mixture of French, Choctaw, and words that belonged to no human language. The other family members joined the chant, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to resonate from the water itself. The floating corpses began to move in response, not from current or wind, but with deliberate purpose that defied natural explanation. Sheriff Melançon watched in horrified fascination as the Belle Marie's passengers arranged themselves into new patterns, their lifeless forms spelling out symbols that hurt to look at directly. This was why the family had taken such care with their positioning. The dead weren't just offerings. They were components in a ritual that transformed murder into something approaching divine communion. The water itself began to change. What had been merely dark became utterly black, as if depth itself was rising from the bayou's bottom. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds, and the air filled with sounds that belonged more to geology than biology. Deep, grinding notes that seemed to emerge from the Earth's core. Something vast was responding to the family's summons, something that had been waiting in the depths since before human civilization learned to fear the dark. The ancient hunger stirs. Deputy Thibodeau fired when the first tentacle breached the surface. Not the gray-green of alligator hide, but something that absorbed light like living shadow. His bullet passed through the appendage without effect, disappearing into substance that existed in violation of physical law. More tentacles emerged, each the diameter of a mature cypress, reaching toward the floating offerings with obvious intelligence and terrible purpose. 7 generations we've fed it. Anatole laughed as his family's chant reached crescendo. 7 generations of the best meat these waters could provide. Timber crews, river merchants, fat tourists who thought they could buy safe passage through our domain. It grows stronger with each feeding, and soon it won't need our help to hunt. The entity that emerged from the killing pool defied description, existing as much in nightmare as in physical reality. Sheriff Melançon caught glimpses of eyes like drowned stars, of mouths that opened in dimensions his mind couldn't process, of forms that shifted between states of matter with fluid disregard for natural law. The Belle Marie's passengers were drawn into its embrace with expressions of terrible peace, as if death had finally offered them rest from torments beyond human comprehension. But even ancient hungers could be surprised. Sheriff Melançon had spent his entire career learning that monsters, no matter how powerful, always made one fatal mistake. They underestimated human desperation. As the entity fed and the Boudreaux family celebrated their communion with primordial darkness, he struck a match and dropped it into the kerosene they'd brought for their lamp. The explosion that followed wouldn't kill an entity older than human civilization, but it would wound it enough to retreat to whatever depths had spawned it. The Boudreaux family, caught between the flames and their wounded god, discovered that 7 generations of service meant nothing to something that viewed time in geological epochs. Sheriff Melançon and Deputy Thibodeau escaped the killing pool as it burned, carrying evidence that would ensure the bayou was declared a federal disaster zone and placed under military quarantine. The official reports spoke of gas leaks and industrial accidents, carefully omitting any mention of entities that violated every law of nature. But sometimes, on foggy nights when the moon is dark, fishing boats report strange lights moving beneath the waters of southern Louisiana, and locals whisper that the hungry water has found new servants to continue the family business. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.